Murray Sinclair, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront. The uncovering of some 1,300 graves containing the remains of Indigenous children at former residential schools, it's made headlines all around the world. How has this revelation impacted the struggle for historical justice among Canada's Indigenous people?
Well, thank you for having me on your show, and thank you for the question. I think it's an important issue for us to be thinking about and talking about. One of the things that we talked about in the report that I was chairing was that the issue of children going missing at the schools and dying at the schools was one that was often played out for us, and we had asked for a mandate to look into that more completely. Sometimes 2 or 3 children would be buried in a grave. Sometimes we heard stories from some of the survivors of residential schools of children actually being killed deliberately. And the one thing that we did point out was that because the government had forcibly removed the children from their families and from their communities, they had some obligation, a moral obligation, if not a legal one, to work with the families to return the bodies of the children to the families and their communities in accordance with the traditions and the practices of those particular communities. And they never did that. But we also pointed out that we had identified about 6,500 names of children who had died in the schools that we could determine from the records of the schools. But we believed, quite honestly, that there were many, many more, probably as much as 8 or 9 times that number, maybe even more.
That's a stunning number to think about. And even as you talk about the stories that you're hearing from people, and Indigenous people have been telling these stories for years of deplorable conditions, abuse, and disappearing classmates. It's really no surprise to the Indigenous communities that this is happening, but it seemed like the broader Canadian public was surprised by this. Polling suggests that. Why has it taken so long for the broader public to catch up, for them to know what's going on?
Well, it would appear to us that there was a deliberate effort by the government of Canada, along with the churches that ran the schools, to cover up the deaths of the children. There was actually a study that was done by the medical director of residential schools by the name of a man by the name of Dr. Peter Bryce back in the early part of the 20th century, about 1910 or so, and he looked at the death rates of children in residential schools in Saskatchewan, and he estimated, based upon the studies that he had done and the evidence that he had before him, that between 25 and 49% of the children in those schools either died at the schools or died shortly after leaving the schools. The poor living conditions, the poor nutrition, the poor lifestyle, the abuse that they experienced, all contributed to their early deaths. And when Dr. Bryce asked to issue his report to the public, they prevented him from doing that, and they actually fired him. And he managed to issue his report on his own privately, but and he called that national crime, his report. But the government refused to endorse it or refused to support it. And in addition to that, it was never really picked up in the media, so that the Canadian society was also implicated in covering up this story, and in particular the media.
It seems to me, as you point out, that the government has claimed ignorance to some extent around this stuff. And that's somewhat puzzling. Former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien in October of this year said that while serving as the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development in the 1960s and 70s, he said that he, quote, was not informed of any abuse at that time. Many other government officials say they had no idea what was going on. How could they have not known? Is that even possible?
No. They're not being truthful when they say that, because we know from the records, again, because we had access to all the government records that were accessible to the public generally, that there were several reports over the years that were made to ministers, that were made to government officials and departmental officials at a senior level, and that those records showed the death rates of children. And these were non-Indigenous people who were writing. The Honorable Tommy Douglas, for example, when he was leader of the NDP in the House of Commons, raised it as an issue. And he was told basically, go back to Saskatchewan and stop talking about these things. So he was verbally criticized for even trying to raise it.
So there's the issue of claiming ignorance and pretending that it never happened. And then there's the idea, alternatively, of saying, oh, that's the distant past. That's a relic of ancient Canadian history, when in fact, the last residential school to close was in 1997. It's a fairly recent part of the Canadian historical narrative. How do residential schools continue at this moment to shape the present and shape how the Indigenous experience plays out?
When the last residential schools closed in the 90s and in the 80s, some of them had been taken over by Indigenous communities. So many of those schools that closed at the end were much better run, and there was a more significant openness, but still there were very bad memories from the people who were there. And some of them have now been destroyed by the communities themselves. But the impact of the schools is widely known, as talked about in our report, and generally what we said was that children who were taken away from their families forcibly were not only separated from their families, separated from their communities and their traditions, their elders, their support people within the community, but they were also separated from their culture, from their language, and they were abused in the schools if they continued to try to function in a way that maintained their language and maintained their culture. They were also taught and brainwashed into believing that they came from an inadequate group of people, that their people were in fact socially, mentally, and in terms of civilization, inferior people to the white European settlers who had come here after the colonial period started. And Canadian history, of course, was only taught from a colonial perspective. So what we said was that the public schools picked up on that message and taught kids in public schools the same thing. And we have had a public school system in Canada that is founded on white supremacy for generations. And that's why there's such a schism between the leadership in this country, usually non-Indigenous men, and the Indigenous community.
One of the most troubling realities for Indigenous children is the foster care system. There are more than 40,000 Indigenous kids in that system. And for context, they make up 8% of the total population and more than half of the foster care system. Do you see the crisis of child welfare as an extension of the residential school problem?
Yeah, what we said was that in reality, the residential schools themselves were a child welfare system. And the child welfare system we see today is just a newer version of the residential school system. The intent being to take children away from their families and to put them into a situation where the system believes that they will become better citizens. They'll become more civilized. They'll be better taken care of than Indigenous people can do. And even when the system has to acknowledge that they themselves have failed the children in their care, they still are authorized by the courts to continue to take children in huge numbers. I've done training sessions with judges, and I said, where in the world would we ever have a justice system that continually gave children over to people who had failed the children that we had already given over to them before? And yet we're doing it without hesitation, without question when it comes to child welfare. But we would never do it if these were private guardians who were trying to take children into their homes.
The Catholic Church ran upwards of 70% of the residential schools. In September, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops issued an official apology. But now there's pressure mounting for the Pope himself to apologize. This month, a delegation of Indigenous leaders will meet the Pope at the Vatican to press for an apology. It's certainly a symbolic gesture, but why is it so significant to get that apology?
Well, when we issued the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, it was one of our calls to action to call upon the Pope to issue that apology. When you go through a situation as Canada has gone through with regard to its treatment of Indigenous people, there has to be a level of awareness there has to be atonement, and there has to be apology. And so what we said is if the Catholic Church is serious about showing its atonement for what it's done in the past, it has to apologize, and it has to show what kind of action it's going to take. And we haven't seen the apology. The apology from the bishops that have been made in the past have not been officially made on behalf of the church.
You served as the chair of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and in 2015, your team laid out 94 calls to action, which were designed to sort of help begin to repair some of the damage that had been done by the residential schools. Prime Minister Trudeau promised to fulfill all of them. So far, only 14 have been fulfilled. 20 have yet to start. What does that mean? Why is justice taking so long?
Well, as I have said to the Prime Minister and to other government officials, the problem that is happening within government is that they don't have a plan. They don't think through what it is that they're committing to, that what it is they're apologizing for, what it is that they need to do. And that plan is missing because there was a feeling at the beginning of the Truth and Reconciliation process on the part of government, and I think the public generally, was that if we throw enough money at this, we'll settle them down, that we'll be able to get them to be quiet. And so there's been a lack of planning. It's that simple.
Murray Sinclair, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you for having me. It's been a good conversation. Thank you.